What does it feel like to become a symbol, before you've had time to become yourself? To be called the it girl, when you're still trying to understand who you are beneath the headlines, beneath the photographs, beneath the stories everyone else is writing about you. Clara Bow knew that feeling. She lived inside that impossible light, that brilliant, burning attention that promised everything and protected nothing. Tonight, we're going to meet Clara as a person, not a headline. Not as a cautionary tale or a scandal or a footnote in film history, but as a human being who lived through something extraordinary and difficult and transformative. We're going to walk slowly through her story, through the glitter and the weight of it, through the moments of triumph and the moments when the world became too much. And we're going to try to understand what early fame asked of a young woman who had so little protection from it, so little preparation for what was coming. This is a story about early celebrity culture and what it asked of a young working-class woman who dreamed of something more. It's a story about the gap between the image and the person, between what the world wanted her to be and who she actually was. It's a story that still matters, because we're still learning how to hold fame gently, how to see the human being beneath the projection. So settle in. Let the story unfold slowly. There's no rush here, no urgency. Just a life, unfolding across the decades, asking to be understood. Clara Bow was born in the summer of 1905, in Brooklyn, New York, in a world very different from the one that would later claim her and reshape her and make her into something both more and less than herself. She arrived in a time when many families, especially working-class families like hers, lived close to the edge of hardship. There was little margin for error, little room for dreaming, little space to imagine a life beyond the immediate struggle for survival. Young girls, especially, were expected to follow a narrow path, one that had been walked by their mothers and grandmothers before them, help at home with whatever needed doing, take work early if the family needed the income, marry if possible and if a suitable match could be found, and become what the world called respectable women, quickly and quietly, without fuss or complaint or visible ambition. The early 1900s was a world where women's independence was tightly restricted by law, by custom, by the simple weight of expectation. But it was also beginning to change, slowly, unevenly, in ways that felt both thrilling and frightening to those who were paying attention. Suffrage was on the horizon, a movement gathering strength. In 1920, just 15 years after Clara's birth, women would gain the vote nationally across the United States. The rules were loosening, just a little, creating new possibilities, new dreams. But the judgments, the old moral codes, the harsh scrutiny of women who stepped outside their prescribed roles, those stayed sharp, stayed dangerous. This shifting landscape matters, because Clara would later be marketed as the embodiment of modern freedom, the girl who broke the rules and made it look effortless, who embodied the new woman of the 1920s with her bobbed hair and her bold spirit and her refusal to be contained. But she would still be judged by the older moral codes, the ones that hadn't yet let go, the ones that punished women for the very freedoms they were supposedly now allowed to claim. She didn't grow up inside glamour. She grew up near grit, near poverty, near the kind of uncertainty that shapes a person in profound ways. And that contrast, that gap between her origins and her destination, never really stopped mattering. It followed her. It shaped how she was seen, how she was judged, how vulnerable she remained even at the height of her fame. Many accounts describe Clara's childhood as difficult, unstable, marked by poverty and uncertainty and the kind of domestic hardship that leaves deep marks on a young person's sense of safety in the world. These early conditions shaped her in profound ways, ways that would stay with her throughout her life. They taught her toughness, resilience, the ability to endure things that might have broken someone with less inner strength. They taught her a hunger for something beyond survival, beyond the grinding limitations of her circumstances. Her early ambition wasn't vanity or selfishness or a shallow desire for attention. It was a form of survival, a reaching toward possibility, toward a life that felt bigger and brighter and more bearable than the one she had been born into. The movies, after all, were one of the first mass dreams available to ordinary people, one of the first places where working-class kids could see lives transformed, elevated, made magical. On screen, working girls could become queens. Plain rooms could transform into palaces. Suffering could turn into triumph. And Clara watched, in darkened theaters, and believed that perhaps the screen could offer her an escape, a transformation, a way out. In the early 1920s, while still a teenager, while still living in Brooklyn with all its constraints and struggles, she entered a film magazine contest, one of those fame and fortune competitions that promised discovery, that promised to turn ordinary girls into stars. And remarkably, against long odds, she won. It didn't guarantee security, not instantly, not in any stable or certain way. But it opened doors. It gave her a foothold in a world that rarely invited girls like her inside, a world that was supposed to belong to people from different backgrounds, different neighborhoods, different kinds of families. Picture this, if you will, as you drift toward sleep. A teenage Clara, alone in a small room, practicing expressions in a mirror, copying the faces of silent film stars she had studied so carefully. Learning their language, the language of gesture and expression that the silent screen demanded. Teaching herself how to become visible, how to command attention, how to translate feeling into image. She was teaching herself, without formal training, without guidance, simply through observation and determination and raw talent. It's a gentle image, really. A private image. A quiet beginning to something that would become so loud, so overwhelming, so far beyond what that teenage girl in Brooklyn could have possibly imagined as she studied her own reflection and dreamed of transformation. By 1927, Clara Bow had become something more than an actress, more than a performer, more than a person pursuing a career. She had become a concept, a brand, a cultural phenomenon compressed into a single word: it. The film It, released that year, was designed as a showcase for her particular magnetism, her specific kind of charisma that seemed to leap off the screen. And it worked beyond anyone's expectations. The It Girl label took hold in popular culture almost immediately, spreading through newspapers and magazines and conversations, becoming shorthand for something everyone seemed to understand but no one could quite define. It was treated as a kind of indefinable charm, a spark that couldn't be manufactured or taught, only recognized when it appeared. And the studio, Paramount Pictures, leaned hard into it, recognizing they had struck gold. They had found a shorthand that made her instantly sellable, instantly marketable, a label that could move tickets and magazines and public fascination. But here's what happens when you become a symbol, when your name becomes synonymous with an idea rather than connected to a person. Your real self starts to fade beneath the story everyone else is telling about you. The narrative takes over. The image becomes more real, more important, more protected than the human being underneath it. And that human being, the actual Clara with her own thoughts and fears and needs and vulnerabilities, becomes increasingly invisible, even to herself. There were early warning signs of the pressure building, accumulating like weight on fragile shoulders. The rapid workload, film after film after film, with barely time to breathe between projects. The constant attention, which felt less like admiration and more like surveillance, like being perpetually watched and evaluated and judged. The sense that her real self, the Brooklyn girl who had fought so hard to be seen, who had won that contest and seized her chance, was becoming harder and harder to protect, harder to access, buried beneath layers of image and expectation and public projection. Fame didn't simply arrive, like a gift or a blessing. It gathered around her, slowly at first and then with increasing intensity, like a storm forming. And then it tightened, like a hand closing around something fragile, squeezing until there was barely room to breathe, barely space to exist as anything other than what everyone else needed her to be. To understand what happened to Clara, to truly grasp the forces that shaped her experience and ultimately broke her down, we need to understand the system she was inside, the machinery of early Hollywood that ground up so many young performers. The studio system, sometimes called the star system, was a powerful machine built on control and image management. Studios and their publicity teams didn't just promote actors and celebrate their talents. They created entire personas from scratch, carefully constructed images designed to sell tickets and protect the studio's reputation above all else. They arranged appearances, planted stories in friendly newspapers, sometimes even manufactured romances for publicity purposes. The star's life became a script, written by executives and publicists and studio heads, with the actual person reduced to a performer of their own existence. Contracts were binding in ways that went far beyond work obligations, far beyond agreeing to appear in certain films. They often included morality clauses, carefully worded language that protected the studio's image above all else, that gave the studio the power to control not just a performer's professional life but their personal life as well. If a star became bad publicity, if scandal touched them, or if they behaved in ways the studio deemed inappropriate, they could be disciplined, suspended, or dropped entirely, their careers destroyed at the studio's discretion. The studio's reputation mattered more than the person's well-being, more than fairness, more than basic human dignity. Clara's workload was relentless, punishing by any reasonable standard. She made a remarkable number of films across the silent era and into the early talkies, dozens of performances compressed into just a few years. Long shooting days that stretched into long shooting weeks. Little true rest between projects. Little privacy, little time to recover or reflect or simply exist without performing. The pace was unsustainable, but the machine didn't care about sustainability. It cared about productivity, about output, about squeezing every possible dollar out of its investment. And then there was the fan culture, which sounds like a compliment, like evidence of success and admiration, but which felt more like a constant presence, an inescapable pressure. Thousands upon thousands of letters arriving each week, requiring responses, requiring the performance of gratitude and accessibility. Magazine spreads tracking her fashion choices, her romantic life, her every public appearance. Gossip columns analyzing her behavior, interpreting her choices, speculating about her private thoughts and feelings. It wasn't flattering. It was exhausting. It was invasive. She was very, very watched. Every moment, every choice, every expression evaluated and judged and discussed by strangers who felt entitled to know her, to possess her, to own a piece of her simply because they had bought a ticket to her films. The 1920s sold the world a new vision of womanhood, a carefully marketed image of liberation and modernity, the modern woman. Bobbed hair replacing the elaborate styles of previous generations. Freer nightlife, with women appearing in speakeasies and dance halls without male chaperones. Consumer glamour, with advertisements celebrating women's purchasing power and independence. Romantic boldness, with new attitudes toward dating and relationships and sexuality. It was marketed as liberation, as progress, as women finally claiming the freedoms that had been denied them for so long. And in some ways, for some women, it was. But women in the public eye, especially actresses, especially those like Clara who were explicitly marketed as embodying this new freedom, were still judged harshly by the old standards that hadn't actually disappeared. The rules hadn't actually changed as much as the advertising suggested, as much as the cheerful magazine articles proclaimed. Women could be modern, but only to a point, only within carefully policed boundaries. They could be desirable, but not too sexual, not threatening to male control or conventional morality. Bold, but not so bold as to actually challenge the underlying power structures. The tightrope was narrow, impossible narrow, and the fall was steep and unforgiving. For actresses, the contradiction was even sharper, even more impossible to navigate successfully. They were marketed as thrilling, as embodying freedom and excitement and sexual allure. Their images sold products, sold fantasies, sold the promise of transformation. But they were still expected to remain acceptable in their personal lives, to stay within invisible boundaries that no one clearly defined, that shifted depending on who was doing the judging. And if they crossed those boundaries, even unknowingly, even while simply living their lives, the backlash was swift and merciless. The same public that had elevated them would turn on them with shocking speed, with shocking cruelty. Clara became a symbol of the Roaring Twenties itself, the embodiment of an entire era's energy and contradictions. That sounds like an honor, like recognition of her cultural importance, and perhaps in some ways it was. But it was also flattening, dehumanizing. People stopped seeing the person, the actual Clara with her own complexity and vulnerability and inner life. They started seeing an idea, a projection, a fantasy of freedom that they could celebrate or condemn depending on their own anxieties and desires. And fantasies are fragile things. They break easily when reality intrudes, when the actual human being fails to live up to the impossible standards of the projection. She didn't invent the gaze, the way of looking at women that reduces them to objects of scrutiny and judgment. But she lived inside it, constantly, without escape or protection, before anyone had developed the language to name it, before anyone understood the psychological toll of being perpetually watched and evaluated and reduced to an image. By the early 1930s, the pressure that had been building for years had become unbearable, unsustainable, a weight that no human being could carry indefinitely. There was a legal case involving her former secretary, a woman named Daisy DeVoe, who had worked in Clara's household and had access to intimate details of her private life. DeVoe sold those details to the press, betraying Clara's trust for money and publicity. The tabloids seized on it with predatory enthusiasm, printing lurid stories, spreading rumors, turning private matters into public spectacle. Clara's sense of safety, which had already been fragile given the constant scrutiny she lived under, shattered completely. The boundary between public and private, which she had tried so hard to maintain, collapsed entirely. The scrutiny was relentless and deeply invasive, examining every aspect of her personal life, her relationships, her choices, with a cruelty that seems shocking even by today's standards. And by 1931, Clara experienced what was widely reported as an emotional breakdown, a collapse that seemed inevitable to anyone who had been paying attention to the mounting strain, the accumulating pressure, the years of relentless work and judgment and invasion. She sought treatment, entering a sanitarium, trying to find some way to recover. She stepped back from the spotlight that had consumed her. She tried to find distance from the industry that had built her up and then consumed her, that had profited from her and then discarded her when she could no longer perform as required. There were other pressures, too, compounding the personal crisis. The transition from silent films to talkies had changed everything about the industry, about what was required of performers. New technology requiring new skills. New expectations for how stars should sound, how they should speak, whether their voices matched their images. Less patience for complexity, for the kind of naturalistic performance Clara had excelled at. Less room for human imperfection, for the vulnerability that had made her performances so compelling. The public's tastes were shifting, drawn to new faces and new styles, and Clara, who had once embodied the cultural moment so perfectly, suddenly seemed out of step with it. Her moment passed despite her relative youth. Her choice to step away, when it finally came, when she could no longer continue, was an act of self-preservation, of choosing survival over success. It may have been misunderstood at the time, interpreted as weakness or failure or proof that she couldn't handle the transition to sound. But in truth, it was brave, perhaps the bravest thing she ever did. It was her reclaiming something the industry had taken from her, something she had nearly lost entirely, her right to protect herself, to choose her own well-being over the demands of fame, to say no to a system that had nearly destroyed her. In 1931, Clara married Rex Bell, an actor who offered her something Hollywood had never provided, something she had desperately needed: steadiness, privacy, protection, a life beyond the spotlight's glare. She retired from acting, walking away from the industry that had made her famous and nearly broken her. Her final film was released in 1933. After that, she moved into a quieter existence, connected to ranching in Nevada, to a slower rhythm of life, to days that belonged to her rather than to studios and publicists and the insatiable demands of public attention. It was a life she could control, a life lived at a human pace rather than the frantic speed the industry demanded. It's time, long past time, to re-evaluate her legacy, not as scandal or cautionary tale or footnote in Hollywood history, but as something richer and more enduring and more worthy of our attention and respect. Clara Bow was a pioneer of modern celebrity, navigating its demands and dangers before anyone understood the psychological cost, before there were therapists who specialized in fame's peculiar pressures, before there was language for what she was experiencing. She was a working-class woman who became a national symbol, who carried the dreams and judgments and projections of an entire era on her shoulders, who bore that weight with remarkable grace for as long as she possibly could. She was a performer whose naturalness, whose aliveness on screen, whose ability to convey genuine emotion and complexity, shaped how femininity would be portrayed for decades to come, influencing generations of actresses who followed her. Her story is also a window into something we're still learning to talk about, still developing compassionate language for: mental well-being under public pressure, the particular burden placed on women whose images are built and sold and consumed and then replaced when they no longer serve the machine's needs, when they can no longer perform the impossible role assigned to them. Her story asks us to think differently about fame, about the cost of visibility, about what we demand from those we elevate. Clara Bow is still remembered, almost a century later, as the It Girl. That label follows her, even now, sticky and reductive and impossible to escape. It appears in every article, every documentary, every brief mention of her name. But what lingers longer, if we let ourselves see it, if we look past the label to the actual person, is her aliveness, the quality that made her so compelling on screen. Her effort, the work she put into her craft despite lacking formal training. Her endurance, the strength it took to survive a world that wanted to consume her entirely. The way she survived, ultimately, by walking away, by finding a way to step into a quieter kind of freedom, one she defined for herself. And perhaps the kindest thing we can do now, the most respectful tribute we can offer, is to let her be human again, fully human in all her complexity. Let her rest from being a symbol, from carrying meanings she never asked to carry. Let her story be more than a headline, more than a scandal, more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of fame. Let her be Clara, just Clara, a person who lived and worked and suffered and survived and found, eventually, a kind of peace.